Alrighty, guys. So today we're going to finish talking about IQ and how that has been used to understand, all the things that we can measure about intelligence and how it's been useful in some ways that it hasn't always been useful. So I started on this section talking about Alfred Binet and how he developed intelligence scores and intelligence tests in order to categorize and organize French children. And even at the start of this process, the tests were really dependent on verbal knowledge and learning. And we'll talk about why, when you depend on certain aspects of understanding, you're going to inherently have bias. So once he did this test was adapted in the United States by Lewis Terman, who was a Stanford psychologist. And what he did was he standardized, which means that he made sure that it was taken the same way in the same setting over and over and over again on US students who were all white at the time. And then he also normed it. So basically giving it to a large group of students and a large amount of students to see what their scores were, and then to compare your results when you take it or when you took it at the time to those students. And it's still done in a similar way. So it's usually standardized. All these tests are standardized, and then they're also normed on a large group of people just to see how the scores change over time. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next video. So here's Alfred Binet, and here's an example of one of the intelligence test questions, like which person is more attractive or which person is prettier. So a test that we use a lot today is the Weschler Adult Intelligence Scale. And so now tests are only allowed to be given by psychologists because these tests have been misused in the past for things like sterilization of certain groups of people. And it was also used in the eugenics movement, which I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but they have been misused in the past. So now these tests are only given by certain psychologists who have experience and who have a good idea and understanding of how testing is supposed to operate. But even so, what we've noticed over the years is that as each generation comes in, so compare baby boomers to Gen X and Gen X to millennials and millennials to Gen Z, what you see is something called the Flynn Effect. So each generation has a much higher IQ or a significantly higher IQ than the last. And it might be tempting to just assume that your generation is smarter than the last generation, but that's not really what's happening. They're trying to understand what's happening, and there's a lot of things that you could consider. It could be in part because of better nutrients, folks have better access to what they need to survive, folks have better education, folks have just more resources. Could be a lot of different things, but we know your environment matters on how you perform on these tests. And the environments change, so the tests change. So what is a bell curve? A bell curve, usually any human trait falls onto a bell curve where most of us as human beings fall within the middle and then everyone else falls to the sides. So this is an example of height, and it usually falls on a bell curve. IQ does the same thing. Most of us fall within the middle, and then you have the outside scores that are a little bit less likely. So these are going to be people who have an intellectual disability or who have gifted or who are gifted, okay? So again, unlikely, but that's like the curve and the sides of the curve. So the question, of course, is nature versus nurture, and why do we see differences in IQ scores between different socioeconomic classes? So in case you are not sure, SES, or social economic status, so socioeconomic status, basically means that in society, you have a certain status because of what you look like, what you identify as. Then you have a certain economic standing. So how much money do you make? How much money do your parents make? Do you have any assets? Did your parents own a house when they had you, or did they own a house before you went to college? And all of those things comprise your status. And we know people who are born into a higher status household, so their parents really adhere to what we consider like traditional values or norms. Their parents have more money, their parents have assets. We know that those children tend to do better on IQ tests and tend to do better on standardized tests in general. And we also know that some ethnic groups tend to do better on IQ tests. And so the question, of course, is why is that? So one of the things that I want to highlight is because a lot of these tests are very verbal, and oftentimes they can include things that have cultural bias. So what that means is that they may ask questions or use wording that is not familiar with all the different cultures in the United States. And so that may bias the test. So to give you an example, when I was teaching in Mississippi, I taught in Mississippi for a while. I taught GED prep courses. This is another story for another day. And when I was teaching there, I was giving my students a test on comparing and contrasting. And on one of the questions, it said, compare Romeo and Juliet to the West Side Story. Now, I was in a small classroom. This was way before COVID. This was years ago. And I had taught all my students individually. So I had actually sat down with them individually and explained the concept to almost, if not all, of my students that day. So when I gave them the assessment, like just to check their understanding, I thought they were all going to get like 100%. I was very confident. But one of the questions asked to compare Romeo and Juliet to the West Side Story. And one of my students said, what is the West Side Story? Now, if you don't know, the West Side Story is, it's like a play. Okay, maybe a play is too soft of a word. It's a theatrical performance. It's theater, a musical. Okay, I had seen the movie. I'd seen the musical. I thought nothing of it. But why am I bringing that up? Because my test didn't measure if they could compare and contrast. It didn't measure what I was actually interested in measuring. It measured how much they knew about the culture that I understood and that I thought everyone knew about. Because I knew Romeo and Juliet and the West Side Story, so I assumed everyone else did. That is an example of how some of these tests operate. They assume a certain level of cultural competence. So if you are from a different culture, if you're in deep rural Mississippi, if you're somewhere else in the world and you don't know those things, it's not measuring necessarily what you innately have. Instead, it's measuring how much you know about this culture, which is different. And so that's a criticism of these tests. They're very verbally based, and so they measure how you use language. And sometimes the way that you use language is indicative of how much you know, but sometimes it isn't. Other people communicate what they know through different means. And the second thing is, when you are from a specific culture, you might have a benefit when taking these tests. So another thing that could affect performance on these tests kind of hints at what I was talking about earlier with this thing that we see at every generation. You see higher performance. So what we notice is something called range of reaction. So you have a certain genetic makeup, and how that genetic makeup, like if your genetic makeup is going to allow you to achieve certain things, depends upon the environment that you are in. So if you think about this from any other perspective, in certain environments, certain things are going to be nurtured. And when that happens, you will be allowed to reach your maybe full academic potential. But let's say that you're in an environment where that doesn't happen, then generally you might not be able to reach that full academic potential. That's the basic idea behind range of reaction. So here are some things to talk about nature versus nurture. So when do you see relationships or correlation? So correlations means that how similar are the two things, right? We talked about this. Are the two variables similar? Are they going in the same direction? So here are correlations about all the different family relationships that you can have in IQ. So let's talk a little bit about learning disabilities and the difference between that and an intellectual disability. An intellectual disability used to be called mental retardation. It's now labeled as intellectual disability. That's a whole separate conversation. I used to work, I had a lot of different jobs, or I had a lot of jobs at the same time would probably be a better way to phrase it. So I used to do mental health, and I also used to work for the Special Olympics. And when I was working for the Special Olympics, this is when I became aware of this cultural shift. So this is when folks started saying things like intellectual disability versus mental retardation, because at that time, people would use the word retarded as an insult and basically use it to say that these folks didn't deserve to be treated like human beings and that they did not deserve the opportunity to do everything that everybody else can do. So that's why the name has been changed. All right. So what is the difference between an intellectual disability and a learning disability? An intellectual disability is usually a developmental disability, and it is usually global, meaning that it affects every aspect of this person's life. There is nothing that they don't do that is not affected by their intellectual disability. It can affect everything from the way that they process information to the way that they have to go grocery shop. A learning disability, on the other hand, tends to be very specific, and it's usually associated with higher than above average intelligence. So folks who have things like dysgraphia or dyslexia tend to have higher than average intelligence, and it doesn't usually affect the other areas of their life. So let's say that you heard someone speaking and they had dysgraphia. You would not know that from the way that they spoke with you. You wouldn't know that from the way that they did anything else in their life except the way that they wrote things down and the way that they spelled words, things to that effect. Okay, basically the way that they were able to collect their thoughts and put them on paper, that's where their learning disability would lie. So it tends to be much more specific, and it is generally different than having an intellectual disability. Well, guys, that is all.